This will be the concluding part of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Chapter 17, From Cape Horn to the Amazon. How I got up to the platform, I have not a notion. Perhaps the Canadian carried me thither, but I breathed. I inhaled the life-restoring sea air. Close to me, my two companions were drinking in the fresh molecules. Men deprived of food for a long time must not too suddenly partake of nourishment. We, on the contrary, had no necessity to limit ourselves. We could inspire to our lungs' content the blessed air, and the breeze alone gave us this delightful sensation of mental intoxication. "Ah," cried Conseil, "how pleasant the oxygen is, and monsieur need not fear to breathe it. There is enough for us all." Ned Land did not speak, but he opened his jaws wide enough to astonish a shark. And what breaths he took! The Canadian drew like a furnace in full blast. Strength quickly returned, and when I looked round me I saw that we were the only occupants of the platform. Not one of the crew was there, not even Captain Nemo. The strange sailors of the Nautilus contented themselves with the air circulating in the interior. Not one of them had come to imbibe the fresh air. My first words were of thanks and gratitude to my two companions. Ned and Conseil had prolonged my existence for the last hours of this long agony. All my thanks could not repay such devotion. "Oh," said the Canadian, "it is not worth speaking about. What merit is there in what we did? None at all. It was only a question of arithmetic. Your life was worth more than ours, therefore it was necessary to preserve it." "No, Ned," I replied, "it was not worth so much. No one is superior to a good and generous man, and you are that." All right," repeated the Canadian in an embarrassed manner. "And you, my brave Conseil, you have also suffered." "But nothing compared to monsieur. I certainly did want air, but I believe that I did right. Besides, I looked at monsieur, who was fainting, and that gave me no encouragement to breathe." "My friends," I replied, much agitated, "we are bound to one another forever, and I am under great obligations to you." "I shall take advantage of that," replied the Canadian. "How?" asked Conseil. "Yes," replied Ned, "I claim the right to take you with me when I leave the Nautilus." "But are we going in the right direction?" said Conseil. "Yes," I replied, "since we follow the sun, and here the sun is in the north." "Certainly," replied Ned, "but it remains to be seen whether we reach the Pacific or the Atlantic, that is to say, a frequented or a deserted ocean." I could not reply to this, and I was afraid that Captain Nemo would carry us rather towards the vast ocean which washes the shores of Asia and America. He would thus complete his tour around the world, and return to the seas where the Nautilus found the greatest liberty. But if we should return to the Pacific, what would become of all the projects of Ned Land? This important point ought to be fixed before long. The Nautilus was going at a great rate. The polar circle was soon cleared, and our course made for Cape Horn. We were off that point of America on March 31st at 7 o'clock p.m. Then all our past sufferings were forgotten. The remembrance of our icy imprisonment melted away. We only thought of the future. Captain Nemo appeared neither on the platform nor in the saloon. The mark upon the chart each day showed me the position of the Nautilus. Now, that evening, to my great satisfaction, it was evident that we were returning to the north by the Atlantic. I apprised Conseil and the Canadian of this. "Good news," said the latter, "but whither is the Nautilus bound?" "That I cannot say, Ned." "Does the captain wish, having seen the South Pole, to discover the North Pole too, and return to the Pacific by the celebrated Northwest Passage, I wonder?" "I should not be surprised," said Conseil. "Well," said the Canadian, "we shall have given him the slip first." At any rate, we must acknowledge that Captain Nemo is a first-rate fellow, and we do not regret having made his acquaintance," said Conseil. "Particularly when we have left him," said Ned. Next day, April 1st, the Nautilus came up to the surface. Some minutes before noon, we noticed land to the westward. This was Terra del Fuego, which was so named by early navigators from the quantity of smoke arising from the native huts. It is a vast agglomeration of islands, extending for a length of 30 and a breadth of 80 leagues. The coast seemed low, but in the distance high mountains appeared. I believe I saw Mount Sarmiento, which is more than 6,000 feet high, a pyramidical block of schist with a very peaked top, which, according as it is clouded or clear, announces bad or fine weather, Ned Land told me. A capital barometer, my friend. Yes, a natural one, and which was always right all the time. I passed it in the Straits of Magellan. On this occasion the top was clearly defined against the heavens, so fine weather was in store for us, and we enjoyed it too. The Nautilus again descended and coasted along. From the saloon windows I could see long seaweeds and gigantic fucus, and the varrock, of which the polar seas contained many specimens, with their viscous and polished filaments. They measured nearly 300 yards in length, regular cables thicker than the thumb and very tough. They often served to fasten ships by. Another plant called velp, with leaves 4 feet in length, enclosed in the corallous concretions, carpeted the depths. They served as nests and food for myriads of crustacea. There the seals and otters lived in clover, mingling the flesh of fish with the vegetables of the sea in English fashion. The Nautilus passed rapidly over these luxuriant regions. Towards evening we neared the Malloweens Isles, whose summits I could see the following day. The sea was of medium depth. I thought, and not unreasonably, that these 2 large islands, surrounded by a number of small ones, were formerly part of the land of Magellan. The Malloweens were probably first discovered by John Davis, who called them Davis Southern Isles. Later, Richard Hawkins called them the Maiden or Virgin Islands, and afterwards they were named Malloweens, at the beginning of the 18th century by the Osseous Fishes, and finally designated Falkland Isles by the English, to whom they now belong. In these places the nets brought up some beautiful specimens of algae, and particularly a certain fucus, whose roots contained some mussels, which are the best in the world. Geese and ducks fell upon the platform in dozens, and were soon in the larder. Amongst the fish I noticed the gobies and bubaros, spotted yellow and white. There were also numerous medusae, and the chrysanes, which are peculiar to those regions. They sometimes appeared like an enormous umbrella, streaked with reddish-brown lines, and terminating in a dozen regular festoons. Sometimes like an inverted cap, from which large leaves and long red twigs escaped in graceful curves. They swam by moving their 4 foliaceous arms, and letting their long, curling tentacles drift behind them. I wish to preserve some specimens, but they evaporate when out of their native element, like shadows or apparitions. When the Falklands had disappeared beneath the horizon, the Nautilus plunged down about 25 yards and followed the American coast. Captain Nemo did not appear. We did not leave the Patagonian coast until April 3rd, and were sometimes above, sometimes under water. We passed the large estuary formed by the La Plata, and on the 4th were opposite Uruguay, but at a distance of 50 miles from land. We still steered north, and followed the trendings of the American coast. We had now made 16,000 leagues since our departure from the Japanese seas. We crossed the Tropic of Cancer on the 37th meridian about 11 a.m. and passed Cape Frio. To Ned Land's disgust, Captain Nemo did not hug these Brazilian shores, and we went at a great pace. Not a bird, nor fish, however rapid, could keep up with us, and all natural curiosities escaped me. This pace was sustained for several days, and on the 9th of April, in the afternoon, we sighted Cape Roque, the most easterly point of South America. But here the Nautilus altered her course again, and sought the deeps of a submarine valley which extends between this cape and Sierra Leone. This valley bifurcates as high up as the Antilles, and ends at the north in a tremendous dip of 2,700 feet. In this place, the geological cutting of the ocean forms a perpendicular cliff of 3.5 miles, as far as the Lesser Antilles. And at the Cape Verde Islands is another wall no less considerable, which thus shuts in the whole of the submerged continent of Atlantis. The bottom of this immense valley is sprinkled with mountains, which gives some picturesqueness to these sub-oceanic depths. I am speaking from information derived from the charts of the Nautilus, charts which Captain Nemo had laid down after personal inspection. For 2 days we visited the deep and deserted waters, but on the 11th of April we rose suddenly to the surface and descried the land of the mouth of the Amazon, an estuary large enough to freshen the seawater for several leagues. We crossed the equator. The Guyanas, a French settlement, lay 20 miles to the west, and on which we could have found refuge easily, but the wind was blowing fearfully and the waves were so high that no ordinary boat could live in them. Ned Land saw that, no doubt for he made no remark to me. For my part, I made no allusion to his plans, for I did not wish to urge him to make an attempt which could only end in failure. I amused myself very easily in the interval by interesting studies. During the 11th and 12th of April, the Nautilus remained at the surface, and the nets brought in a miraculous draught of zoophytes, fish, and reptiles. Some zoophytes had been dragged up by the chain. These were chiefly fictolines belonging to the Actinidian family, and amongst other species were the Fictalis protexta, a native of this part of the ocean, a little cylindrical trunk striped with vertical lines and studded with red dots which cover a marvellous show of tentacles. The mollusks consisted of those I have already mentioned, such as Turtillas, olive porphyras, pteroceras, like petrified scorpions, and cuttlefish, which are very good to eat. I noted various species of fish on these shores, which I had not hitherto studied. Amongst the cartilaginous specimens were the Petromyzus pricker, a kind of eel 15 inches in length, greenish head, fins violet, and the back a bluish-grey colour. The belly is brown, of a silvery hue, and speckled. The pupils of the eyes are surrounded with a golden circle. A curious animal this, which the current of the river Amazon had carried out to sea, for it is a fresh-water fish. There were tubercular rays, with pointed nose, a long and loose tail, armed with a long-toothed sting. Little sharks about 3 feet long, commonly known as pantoufles. Lophic vespertilios, a sort of reddish isosceles triangle, half a yard long, which looked like bats, owing to the prolongation of their pectoral fins, but the horny appendage placed near the nostrils has caused them to be denominated sea unicorns. Finally, some specimens of Ballistae, the Curasavian, spotted with brilliant gold dots, the Capriscus of pure violet with varying colours of the pigeon's throat. I will end this somewhat dry but exact catalogue with a series of Osseous fishes that I observed. The passans, belonging to the aptonotes, with blunt snow-white noses, the body of a beautiful black, furnished with a long, slender, fleshy stripe. Odontognaths, there we go, with spikes. Immense sardines, glittering with silver scales, mackerel provided with 2 anal fins, black centronotes, for which they fish with torches. These fish are about 2 yards in length, flat, with white firm flesh, When fresh they taste like eels, when dried like smoked salmon. And labras, covered with scales at the bases of the anal and dorsal fins. Chrysoptera, in which gold and silver scales blend in brightness. Anableps of Suriname, etc. But this, etc. must not prevent me from mentioning another fish, which Conseil for a long time kept in remembrance, and with good reason. One of our nets had hauled up a kind of ray fish, very flat, with its tail cut off. One of our nets had hauled up a kind of ray fish, very flat, which, with its tail cut off, would have formed a perfect disc, and which weighed nearly 40 pounds. It was white underneath, red above, with large round spots of blue, surrounded with black and very smooth skin. It struggled as it lay upon the platform, and, endeavouring to turn itself, making so many efforts that it nearly fell back into the sea. But Conseil, wishing to keep it, threw himself upon it, and before it could prevent him, had seized it with both hands. He was immediately knocked down, his legs high in the air, with half his body paralysed, and he cried out, "Oh, master, master, come to me!" This was the first time he had not addressed me in the third person. The Canadian and I raised him up. We rubbed his paralysed arms, and when this inveterate classifier recovered his senses, he murmured, "Class Cartilaginous, Order Chondropterygians, Suborder Salations, Family Rays, Genus Torpedoes." "Yes, my friend," I replied, "it is a torpedo that has knocked you over in this way. Ah, monsieur may believe me, I will be revenged on that animal." "How?" "By eating him." Which was done that same evening, but in pure reprisal, for, to tell the truth, he was very tough. The unfortunate Conseil had been attacked by a torpedo of the most dangerous species, the cumana. This curious animal, in a medium conductor like water, can give a shock to fish at several yards' distance, so great is its power in the electric organs, the two principal surfaces of which measure 27 square feet at least. During the following day, the 12th of April, the Nautilus approached the Dutch coast near the mouth of the Maroni. There were several herds of lamantins here. They were manatees which, like the dugong and the stellera, belong to the Sirenian order. These beautiful animals, peaceable and inoffensive, measured between 18 and 21 feet in length, and weighed at least 3 tons. I told Ned Land and Conseil that nature had assigned a very important part to these animals. They, like the seals, are intended to feed upon the submarine prairies, and so destroy the accumulations of plants which block the mouths of tropical rivers. "And do you know," I added, "what has happened since men have almost entirely destroyed this useful race? The grasses have putrefied and poisoned the air, and that has given rise to yellow fever, which has laid waste beautiful districts. Poisonous vegetation multiplies in these tropical seas, and the evil is irresistibly developed from the mouth of the La Plata to Florida. And if we can credit Toussaint, this plague is nothing at all to what will happen to our descendants when the seas become depopulated of whales and seals. Then, infested with cuttles, medusae, and calamars, the waves will become vast hotbeds of infection, since they will no longer possess those vast stomachs that God has commanded to scour the surface of the seas." But without disputing this theory, the crew of the Nautilus caught 6 manatees. They did so to provision the ship with excellent meat, superior to beef or veal. The capture was not interesting. The manatees permitted themselves to be killed without resistance. Many 1,000 pounds weight of meat destined to be dried was stored on board. This day a tremendous haul of fish increased the reserves of the Nautilus. The seas are so very rich. The net brought up a number of fish whose heads terminated in an oval plate with fleshy edges. These were echinades of the third family of the subbrachian Malacopterygians. This was the echinade ostioca, peculiar to those seas. When taken, the sailors put them in buckets filled with water. When the fishing was over, the Nautilus approached the coast. A number of tortoises were sleeping on the surface, otherwise it would have been difficult to capture them, for the least noise awakens them and their shells are proof against the harpoon. But the echinade captured them with extraordinary precision. This animal is in fact a living fishhook which would make a tyro's fortune. The sailors tied to the tail a ring sufficiently large not to encumber its movements, and to this ring was fastened a long cord fastened to the Nautilus. The echinade, thrown into the sea, fixed themselves to the breastplate of the tortoises. Their tenacity was so great that they suffered themselves to be torn to pieces rather than let go. They were hauled on board with the tortoises to which they had attached themselves. Several cacananes were also taken, weighing 400 pounds. Their shells, covered with horny plates, thin, brown and transparent, fetch a high price. They are also excellent eating, like the fresh turtles. This fishing brought our sojourn at the Amazon to a close, and, as night fell, the Nautilus steered for the open sea. Chapter 18. The Octopus. For some days, the Nautilus gave the American coast a wide berth. Captain Nemo evidently did not wish to encounter the waves of the Gulf of Mexico or of the Antilles seas. There was no want of water there, for the average depth is about 1,800 yards, but probably the islands with which the seas are studied did not recommend them to the captain. On the 16th of April, we sighted Martinique and Guadeloupe at 30 miles distance. I saw the high peaks for a moment. The Canadian, who had counted upon putting his plans of escape into execution in the Gulf, either by landing on some island or by hailing one of the numerous vessels which ply from one island to another, was very much put out. Flight would have been practicable had Ned been able to get possession of the boat without the captain's knowledge, but in the open sea it was useless to think of it. Ned, Conseil, and I had a long conversation on this subject. We had now been 6 months on board the Nautilus. We had sailed 17,000 leagues, and, as Ned remarked, it was time to put an end to it. He suggested that we should go and put the question boldly to Captain Nemo whether he intended to keep us on board forever. But to this I would not agree. We had nothing to hope from the captain. We must trust to ourselves. Besides, for some time he had become gloomy, reserved and unsociable. He seemed to avoid me. I only encountered him at rare intervals. Formerly he seemed pleased to be able to explain the wonders of the sea. Now he left me to my studies in the saloon. What change was come of him, and why? I had no reason to reproach myself. Perhaps our presence on board worried him. Nevertheless, I did not think he would give us our liberty. I therefore begged Ned to pause before acting. If this attempt had no result, it would only revive his suspicions and render our position unpleasant and injurious to the projects of the Canadian. I will add that I could adduce no argument on the score of health. If I accept the rough experience beneath the iceberg, we had never been better in our lives. The healthy food, the pure air, the regularity of our lives, with the uniformity of temperature, gave illness no chance, and for a man who did not regret the world, or, like Captain Nemo, who was at home, who went where he chose, I could understand the pleasure of such an existence. But for us, we had not broken with mankind. I did not wish to bury with me my curious and novel studies. I had now the right to write a true book of the sea, and I wished sooner or later to have it published. Then again, in the waters of the Antilles, at 10 yards beneath the surface, by the open panels, what interesting objects had I to note daily? Here, amongst other zoophytes, were those known as Physalis pelagica, like large oblong bladders with mother-of-pearl rays, lifting their membranes to the breeze and letting their long blue tentacles float like silken threads. Beautiful medusae to look at, but regular nettles to touch, and distilling a corrosive liquid. Among the articulates were annelids, 1.5 yards in length, armed with a rose-coloured horn, and furnished with 1,700 organs of locomotion, which twined about in the water and reflected all the colours of the solar spectrum. Amongst the fish were Malabar Rays, enormous cartilaginous fish 10 feet long and 600 pounds, in a triangular pectoral fin on a lumpy back, eyes fixed beyond the head at the extremities of the face, and which floated like wreckage, and appearing sometimes like a shutter before our windows. There were the American Ballistae, dressed by Dame Nature in black and white, gobies, mackerel of enormous size, of the albacore species. Then we had grey mullet in shoals, striped with gold from head to tail, moving their resplendent fins, which shone like a masterpiece of jeweller's workmanship. These were formerly consecrated to Diana, and were particularly sought after by rich Romans, and of which the proverb states, "Who takes them does not eat them." Lastly, Pomacanthidories, ornamented with emerald bands, dressed in silk and velvet, passed like Veronese lords. What a number of other specimens I might have noted had not the Nautilus dived to the lowest depths. Here, animal life is not represented except by ecrines, starfish, pentacrines, medusae heads, trochs, and such like. On the 20th of April, we had risen to a medium height of 1,500 yards. The nearest land was the Bahamas, lying like a number of paving stones at the surface of the sea. High cliffs rose up, perpendicular walls, rough blocks placed in long layers, amongst which were deep holes to the end of which our electric light could not penetrate. These rocks were clothed with immense sea grasses and weeds, hydrophytes worthy of a Titan world. From speaking of enormous plants, Ned and Conseil naturally turned to gigantic animals in the sea. The former were evidently intended to nourish the latter, while from the windows of the saloon I did not see any but the principal articulates of the division of Brachiosa, long-footed lampreys, violet crabs, and cleos peculiar to the Antilles. About 11 a.m, Ned Land directed my attention to the extraordinary amount of movement going on amongst the algae. "Well," I said, "they are the regular caves of cuttlefish, and I should not be surprised to see one of those monsters." "What?" cried Conseil. "Calmars, simple calmars of the class of cephalopods?" "No," I replied, "but cuttlefish of enormous size. But perhaps friend Ned is mistaken, for I can perceive none of them." "I am sorry for it. I should like to see one of those porpoises of which I have heard, which are able to drag ships under the water. They are called It is a regular cracker altogether, I should think," said Ned. "Cracker will do." "Krakens," replied Conseil, having got out the word without noticing his companion's chaff. "You will never make me believe that such animals exist," said Ned. "Why not?" exclaimed Conseil. "You believe Monsieur's narwhal." "We were wrong, Conseil." "No doubt, but other people believe it still." "It is probable, Conseil, but I have made up my mind not to admit the existence of these monsters till I have dissected them myself," said I. "So," replied Conseil, "Monsieur does not believe in these gigantic octopi?" "Why, who the devil has ever believed in them?" asked Ned. Excuse me. "Lots of people, friend Ned." "No fishermen. Savants may." "Excuse me, Ned, both fishermen and savants." "But," said Conseil with the most serious air in the world, "I perfectly remember to have seen a large ship pulled down beneath the waves by one of the arms of a cuttle." "You have seen that?" exclaimed the Canadian. "Yes, Ned." "With your own eyes?" "With my own eyes." "And where, if you please?" "At Saint-Malo," replied the imperturbable Conseil. "In the harbour, I suppose," said Ned, ironically. "No, in a church." "In a church!" exclaimed Ned. "Yes, there is a picture there representing the cuttle." Capital, cried Ned, laughing. Conseil did puzzle me a bit. As a fact, he is quite right, I said. I have heard of that picture, but the subject is taken from a legend, and you know what to think of legends when applied to natural history. Besides, when monsters are in question, the imagination is apt to run wild a little. Not only has it been stated that these cuttles can drag ships down, but a certain Olaus Magnus speaks of a cephalopod a mile long, which was more like an island than an animal. It is also recounted that the Bishop of Nidros one day built an altar upon an enormous rock. Mass concluded, the rock got up and departed to the sea. The rock was a cuttle. Is that all? Said Ned. No. Another bishop, Pontoppidan de Bergen, also speaks of a cuttle upon which he could exercise a regiment of cavalry. They said something besides their prayers, did those bishops, replied Ned. Finally, the ancient naturalists quote monsters whose throats were like gulfs, and which were too large to get through the Straits of Gibraltar. Oh, go ahead, said the Canadian. But now, what is the truth of all this? Asked Conseil. Nothing, my friends, nothing at least but which passes the limits of truth and reaches legend or fable. Still, there is at any rate some ground or pretext for this play of the imagination of storytellers. One cannot deny that cuttles and calmars of great size do exist, but they are not so large as cetacea. Aristotle mentioned a calmar of 5 cubits, nearly 10 yards in length. Fishermen have often met with them more than 4 feet long. The museums of Trieste and Montpellier have skeletons of poulps measuring 2 yards. Besides, according to the calculation of naturalists, one of these animals, measuring 6 feet only, has tentacles 27 feet in length. That would be a formidable monster. Do they fish for them at present? Asked Ned Land. If they do not fish for them, sailors see them. One of my friends, Captain Paul Boz of Havre, has often told me that he met an enormous cuttle in the Indian seas. But the most astonishing incident, and one that will not allow us to deny the existence of these animals, happened in 1861. How was that? Asked Ned. In 1861, at the northeast of Tenerife, not far from where we are now, the crew of the dispatch vessel Alecto perceived an enormous cuttle. Captain Bongueur approached it and attacked it with harpoons and guns without any marked success, for both bullets and harpoons recoiled from its flesh, which is like soft jelly. After many attempts, they succeeded in fastening a rope round the animal's body. The noose slipped to the caudal fins, and there it stopped. They then attempted to haul the monster on board, but his weight was so enormous that the tail was separated from the body, and, deprived of this ornament, the cuttle disappeared beneath the waves. At length we have a fact, said Ned Land. An indisputable fact. So it was proposed to name the poulp the Bongueur cuttlefish. How long was it? Asked the Canadian. Did it not measure about 6 yards? Said Conseil, who was posted at the window watching the fishes in the cliffs. Precisely, I replied. Was not its head crowned with 8 tentacles, which moved about in the water like a nest of serpents? Quite so, I replied. Were not the eyes placed at the back of the head and very large? Yes, Conseil, and was its mouth like a parrot's beak, but a very terrible one? Quite true, Conseil. Well, then, if monsieur pleases, replied Conseil quietly, if yonder is not Bongueur's cuttlefish, it is one of the family. I gazed at Conseil. Ned Land rushed to the window. The horrible beast! He cried. I, in my turn, came to look, and could not repress a shudder of disgust. Before my eyes was a fearful monster, worthy to figure in legends of the marvellous. It was a cuttle of enormous dimensions, 8 yards long. It moved sideways with extreme velocity in the direction of the Nautilus. It gazed at us with its enormous, staring, sea-green eyes. Its 8 arms, or rather its 8 feet, were fixed to its head, which gave these animals the name of cephalopods. were double the length of its body and turned about like the headdress of the Furies. We could distinctly see the 250 air holes on the inner side of the arms, shaped like semi-spherical capsules. Sometimes these air holes fastened against the window and thus emptied themselves. The monster's mouth, a horny beak like that of a parrot, opened vertically. Its horny tongue itself, armed with many ranges of sharp teeth, came quivering from out those veritable shears. What a freak of nature this! A bird's beak on a mollusk! Its body, shaped like a spindle and swollen in the middle, formed a fleshy mass which must have weighed 40,000 or 50,000 pounds. Its colour changed with great rapidity according to the irritation of the animal, passing successively from a livid grey to a reddish-brown tinge. What irritated the mollusk? No doubt the presence of the Nautilus, more formidable than itself, and on which its beak and tentacles had no effect. What monsters these cuttles are, what vitality they possess, what vigour they must have in their movements, since they have 3 hearts. Chance had brought us in contact with this octopus, and I did not wish to lose the opportunity to study the specimen carefully. I overcame the horror with which its appearance inspired me, and, seizing a pencil, I commenced to make a sketch of it. "Perhaps this is the same that the Electo encountered," said Conseil. "No," said the Canadian, "because this one is complete. The other fellow had lost a tail." "This is no reason," I replied. "These animals can reform their arms and tail by redintegration, and in 7 years the tail of Bonger's cuttle, no doubt, has had time to grow again." "Besides," replied Ned, "if this be not the one, it may be one of those others." As he spoke, other cuttles appeared at the window. I counted 7 of them. They attended on the Nautilus, and I heard the grinding of their beaks on the iron hull. We had enough now, at any rate. I continued my work. The monsters kept their places with such precision that they appeared immovable, and I was able to draw them foreshortened on the glass. Besides, we were not going fast. Suddenly the Nautilus stopped. A shock was felt all through her frame. "What have we struck?" I exclaimed. "In any case we are free, for we are floating," said the Canadian. The Nautilus was floating, certainly, but it was not moving. The screw was not going. A minute passed when Captain Nemo and his mate entered. I had not seen the captain for some time. He seemed preoccupied. Without speaking, perhaps without seeing us, he went to the panel, looked at the cuttlefish, and said something to the mate. The latter went out. The panels were soon closed, and the ceiling was lighted. I approached the captain. "A curious collection of cuttles," I said, in the easy way a person might speak of them in an aquarium. "Yes, indeed, Professor, and we are going to fight them hand to hand." I looked at the captain, not thinking I had heard aright. "Hand to hand?" I repeated. "Yes, the screw is stopped. I think one of their horny beaks has seized it. That is why we cannot move." "And what are you going to do?" "Rise to the surface and kill the vermin." "Rather difficult, won't it?" "Yes, indeed, for the electric bullets do not meet with sufficient resistance in their pulpy bodies to take effect." "But we shall attack them with hatchets." "And a harpoon," suggested the Canadian, "if you will accept my assistance." "I do, Master Land." "We will accompany you," I said, and, with Captain Nemo, we advanced to the staircase. There, a dozen men, armed with boarding hatchets, were in readiness for the attack. Conseil and I armed ourselves likewise. Ned Land seized a harpoon. The Nautilus now floated at the surface. One of the sailors, placed on top of the ladder, unscrewed the bolts of the panel, but the screws were scarcely loosened when the panel was wrenched violently open, evidently drawn in by the suckers of an octopus. Immediately, one of the long arms glided through the aperture, and 20 others were moving above. With a single blow, Captain Nemo cut off this formidable tentacle, which slid writhing down the ladder. As we were pressing forward, together to reach the platform, 2 other arms, circling in the air, fell upon a sailor who was in front of Captain Nemo, and raised him up with irresistible power. Captain Nemo uttered a shout and rushed in front. We followed. What a sight it was! The unhappy sailor, seized by the tentacle and fixed upon the sucker, was balanced in the air by this enormous trunk. He gasped. He was almost stifled. He cried out, "Help! Help!" These words, pronounced in French, astonished me greatly. I had a fellow countryman on board, several perhaps. I shall hear that heart-rending appeal all my life. The poor fellow was lost. Who could tear him from such a grasp as that? Nevertheless, Captain Nemo threw himself upon the octopus and cut off one arm at a blow. The mate waged a terrible fight with the others, which were assailing the sides of the Nautilus. The ship's company fought with hatchets. The Canadian, Conseil, and I wearied our arms hacking at these fleshy masses. A strong odour of musk pervaded the air. The scene was horrible. For a moment I hoped that the unfortunate sailor seized by the octopus would be released. 7 of the 8 arms had been cut off, only one now brandishing like a feather twined aloft. But as Captain Nemo and his mate both rushed at the animal, it ejected a column of black liquid, secreted in a bag near the abdomen, at them. They were blinded, and when they recovered, the octopus had disappeared with our unfortunate friend. Enraged against the monsters, we rushed pell-mell amongst 10 or a dozen which had now gained the platform and sides of the Nautilus, which were soon covered with waves of inky blood. The viscous tentacles seemed to spring up like hydra heads. Ned Land, at each thrust of his harpoon, blinded the great staring eyes, but my companion was suddenly overturned by the tentacles of a monster that he had not been able to avoid. My heart beat wildly. The beak of the octopus was extended over Ned Land. He would be cut in half. I rushed to his assistance, but Captain Nemo anticipated me. He flung his hatchet between the enormous mandibles, and the Canadian, miraculously rescued, plunged his harpoon into the triple heart of the octopus. "I owe myself that revenge," said the captain to Ned Land. Ned bowed, but made no reply. The fight had lasted a quarter of an hour. The monsters, conquered, mutilated, beaten to death, left us at last and disappeared. Captain Nemo, red with blood, stood motionless near the lantern, gazed into the sea, which had swallowed up one of his companions, and great tears stood in his eyes. And that brings us to the first break that I should be taking. So I will do that, and we'll see you back here in about 5 minutes. Get up, have a stretch, rotate those fluids, and see you in a bit. and I will have absolutely just cut across the middle of the music there because I got a little bit distracted with something that I was doing, and just let it roll around because, you know, why not? Let everyone enjoy a slightly longer break. But yeah, Yumika, welcome. And yeah, I'm really sorry that I mean, yeah, there's going to be yourself and a number of people who have made some sort of financial commitment to be at the gig, or what would have been the gig, and yeah, that does really suck. Obviously, it's good that they've been able to refund or transfer the tickets for the actual show, but travelling as well is an expense and a commitment. So yeah, really sorry that you've kind of had to financially commit to that, and presumably some time in advance to actually get decent cheap tickets, or affordable tickets, and yeah, it's just a real shame, obviously. And yeah, don't worry, no. Yeah, every response that I've seen has been perfectly, like, understanding and graceful. Like, nobody wanted this, and everyone knows that. So yeah, it's just kind of a shame for everyone, really, because they will have been absolutely looking forward to the gig. And yeah, so obviously will everyone who was going to be attending. So yeah, just hope that when they can, that it turns out to be a really good show anyway, and that everyone who would have been attending is still able to attend. Yeah, and just hope that everyone stays well, because again, like, it's on a bit of a rise here. Anyway, I don't want to talk too much. I want to get back to the story, but yeah, it's on a bit of a rise here, and it's still assembling a bunch of people in a venue like that. It's still going to be a risk. So hopefully it's pragmatic, but hopefully it does work out just better for everyone, as best as it can be. Yeah. But yes, welcome. I hope you're well. I hope the free diving is going good, and that's really cool that you're actually, like, doing it. Yeah. But yeah, I shall continue with where we got to, and I'll just let you carry on chatting. That's fine. You all go about that, talk about the things. But I'm going to carry on with Chapter 19, the Gulf Stream. None of us will ever forget that terrible scene on the 20th of April. I have written the account of it under excitement, but since I have revised the description and read it to Ned and Conseil, they found it quite correct as to fact, but wanting in effect. To describe such incidents properly, one must have the pen of the most illustrious of our poets, the author of The Toilers of the Sea. I have stated that Captain Nemo was much affected while regarding the waves. His grief was intense. This was the second companion he had lost since our arrival on board. What a death, too. A friend stifled, crushed and bruised in the formidable arms of an octopus, and pounded between his iron mandibles, could never repose with his messmates in the peaceful waters of the coral cemetery. The cry of despair uttered by the unhappy sailor was still ringing in my ears. This poor Frenchman, oblivious of his conventional dialect, was constrained to speak his mother tongue in a last appeal for help. Amongst the crew of the Nautilus, linked body and soul with Captain Nemo, flying with him any contact with mankind, I had a fellow countryman. Was he the only representative of France in this mysterious association evidently composed of individuals of different nationalities? This was one of those unsolvable problems that were continually agitating my mind. Captain Nemo entered his own room, and I did not see him again for some days. But that he was ill and careless and irresolute I could perceive, as the ship of which he was the soul received all its impressions from him. The Nautilus did not maintain the fixed direction. It moved and floated like a corpse tossed by the waves. The screw had been disconnected, and so was no use. We steered at random and could not get away from the neighbourhood of our late encounter, from those very waves that engulfed our friend. 10 days passed in this manner, and the 1st of May arrived ere the Nautilus actually resumed her old course, having sighted the Bahamas. We then followed the current of the greatest river of the sea, which has its own banks, its fish and temperature. I mean the Gulf Stream. It is, in fact, a river which runs freely to the middle of the Atlantic, and whose waters do not mingle with any ocean waves. It is a salt river, more salt than sea surrounding it. Its average depth is 3,000 feet, its average breadth 60 miles. In certain places the current runs at the rate of nearly 3 miles an hour. The unvarying volume of its waters is greater than that of all the rivers of the globe. The true source of the Gulf Stream, discovered by Commander Maury, its point of departure, if you prefer the term, is in the Gulf of Gascony. There its waters, feeble in colour and temperature, commence to form. It descends to the south by equatorial Africa, warms itself in the rays of the torrid zone, crosses the Atlantic, touches Cape San Roque on the Brazilian coast, and divides. One branch goes to be again warmed by the waters of the Antilles. Then the Gulf Stream, charged to re-establish the temperature and to mingle the waters of the tropics with the northern seas, commences to play its part of intermediary. Warmed to a great height in the Gulf of Mexico, it runs along the American coast nearly to Newfoundland, deviates under pressure from a cold current from Davis Straits, resumes the ocean route, followed by the Loxodromic Line, one of the great circles of the globe, divides into 2 branches about the 43rd degree. One arm, assisted by the northeast trade winds, returns to the Gulf of Gascony and to the Azores, while the other, having laved the coasts of Ireland and Norway, flows as far as Spitzbergen, where its temperature falls to 4 degrees, to form the open polar seas. It was this ocean river that the Nautilus then entered. At the mouth of the Bahama Canal, about 14 leagues out and 350 yards deep, the Gulf Stream flows at the rate of 5 miles an hour. This pace decreases regularly in proportion as it advances towards the north, and it is to be hoped that this regularity may continue, for if its direction and pace undergo any alteration, the disturbances to European climates would involve very serious consequences. Towards noon, I was with Conseil upon the platform. I gave him some particulars relative to the Gulf Stream. When I had finished, I suggested his putting his hand into the water. He did so, and was surprised not to perceive any sensation either of heat or cold. "That is," I said, "because the temperature of the waters of the Gulf Stream, when leaving the Gulf of Mexico, is very little different from that of the blood. This Gulf Stream is a vast conductor of warmth, which clothes the coasts of Europe with verdure, and, if we may credit Maury, the aggregate temperature of its waters would supply sufficient heat to hold in fusion a river of molten iron, as large as the Amazon or the Missouri." At this time the speed of the Gulf Stream was 2.25 yards per second. Its current is so distinct from the surrounding sea that its compressed waters mingle with the ocean waves. Darker than the others and richer in saline matter, the waves of the Gulf Stream trace their course in pure indigo amid the green waters around them. Such is the distinctness of the line of demarcation that the Nautilus, at the latitude of the Carolines, separated the waters of the Gulf Stream with her prow, while the screw revolved in those of the ocean. The current carried with it all kinds of living things. Argonauts, so common in the Mediterranean, were here sailing in fleets. Amongst cartilaginous fishes, the most remarkable were the rays, the slender tails constituting nearly 1/3 of their bodies, and looked like large lozenges, 25 feet long. Small sharks, a yard in length, large heads, muzzles short and rounded, pointed teeth arranged in several rows, and very scaly bodies. Amongst the bony fishes, I noted the grey goby, peculiar to this region, the black gilt head, the eyes of which sparkled like fire, sirens a yard long with large mouths filled with little teeth. These fish uttered low cries. Blue coryphenes, striped with gold and silver, parrotfish, the true ocean rainbows, which could rival the most splendid tropical birds in colours, triangular-headed blennies, blue roms denuded of scales, batrachoids covered with yellow transversal bands, something like the Greek letter T, little gobies in crowds, dipterus with silvery heads and yellow tails, salmon, muggilamores, slender and shining with a soft radiance, which Lacépède consecrated to his amiable wife, and finally a large fish called the American Chevalier, which, decorated with many orders and covered with ribbons, frequents the coast of that great nation where ribbons and orders are so very lightly esteemed. I may add that during the night the phosphorescent waters of the Gulf Stream rivaled our own electric light, particularly during the stormy weather. On the 8th of May we passed Cape Hatteras. The width of the Gulf Stream is here 75 miles, its depth 210 yards. The Nautilus still sailed at random. All supervision seemed suspended on board. I began to consider that, under these circumstances, escape was possible. The inhabited coasts offered us easy refuge. Steamers from New York or Boston were continually passing on their way to the Gulf of Mexico, and, night and day, pretty little schooners were darting from point to point of the American coast. We might really hope to be picked up. This was, therefore, a favourable occasion, notwithstanding the 30 miles of water that separated the Nautilus from the United States. But an untoward circumstance balked the plans of Ned Land. The weather was very bad. We were approaching latitudes where storms are frequent. The district of waterspouts and cyclones engendered by the current of the Gulf Stream. To launch upon a tempestuous sea in a frail boat was to court certain destruction. Ned Land even confessed as much, so he fretted himself into a regular attack of homesickness, which flight only could cure. "Monsieur," he said one day, "this must come to an end somehow. I wish to make a clean breast of it. Your Nemo is quitting land and going north, but I declare that I had enough of the South Pole, and I will not go up to the North Pole as well." "But what are we to do, Ned, since flight at present is impracticable?" "I come back to my original notion. We must speak to the captain. You said nothing when we were in your national seas. I wish to speak now that we are in mine. When I consider that in a few days the Nautilus will be close to Nova Scotia, and near Newfoundland is a large bay into which the St. Lawrence flows, and that the St. Lawrence is my river, the river of Quebec, my native town. And when I think of all this, I get angry. It makes my hair stand on end with rage, and I would rather throw myself into the sea than stay here." The Canadian was fast losing patience. His vigorous manhood could not brook this prolonged imprisonment. His appearance was daily altered. His temperament became morose. I knew what he was suffering, for I began to have a touch of that homesickness. Nearly 7 months had elapsed, and we had no news from Earth. Further, The isolation of Captain Nemo, his changed habits, particularly since our encounter with the cuttlefish, his taciturnity gave all things a very different appearance. I no longer looked at things with my former enthusiasm. One must be a Fleming, like Conseil, to adapt oneself to the present circumstances in this water, reserved for cetacea and such like animals. Indeed, had Conseil been furnished with gills instead of lungs, I believe he would have taken a high position amongst fishes. "Well, sir," said Ned, perceiving I did not reply. "Well, do you wish me to ask Captain Nemo what are his intentions concerning us?" "Yes, sir." "Even though he has already made them known?" "Yes." "I should like the matter to be decided. Speak for me in my name only if you prefer to do so." "But I so seldom meet him. He even avoids me." "All the greater reason to go and see him." "I will ask him, Ned." "When?" "Whenever I meet him. Monsieur Aronnax, shall I go and see him myself?" "No. Let me do it." "Tomorrow." "Today," said Ned. "Well, then today be it." "I will go and see him," I replied. Had the Canadian gone and got angry, everything would have been compromised. I was alone. As it had been decided, I was to ask As it had been decided I was to ask, the sooner it was done, the better. I entered my own room, whence I meant to go to Captain Nemo's cabin. I must not permit this opportunity to escape. I knocked. No answer being given, I knocked again. Then I turned the handle and entered. The captain was in his room. Bending over his work, he had not heard me. Determined not to leave without asking him the question, I approached him. He raised his head suddenly, frowned, and said in a rude tone, "You here! What do you want?" "To speak to you, Captain." "But I am engaged. I am at work." "You can be private if you choose. Cannot I have the same privilege?" This reception was not very encouraging, but I was determined to hear all, to answer all. "Yes," I said coldly, "I have to speak to you of a matter that will not admit of delay." "What is that?" he said ironically. "Have you made some discovery that has escaped me? Has the sea revealed any new secret to you?" We were at cross purposes, but before I could reply he said gravely, "Monsieur Aronnax, here is a missive, written in several languages. It contains the digest of Rays studies beneath the sea, and, please goodness, it will not perish with me. This missive, signed by me, completed by the history of my life, will be enclosed in a small, unsinkable case. The last survivor of all of us on board the Nautilus will throw this into the sea, and it will go whithersoever the waves may carry it. The name of this man, his history written by himself. The mystery shall then be dissolved some day, but at the moment I only saw in this communication an opening to my business." "Captain," I replied, "I can but approve your resolve. It is not right that the result of your studies should be lost, but the means you intend to employ are primitive. Who knows where the wind may carry your work, or into whose hands it may fall? Cannot you devise something better? Cannot you or one of your—" "Never, sir!" he cried, hastily interrupting me. "But I and my companions are willing to take care of this missive, and if you set us at liberty—" "At liberty!" exclaimed Captain Nemo, rising. "Yes, and it is upon this subject I came to speak to you. For 7 months we have been on board, and I ask today, in my companions' names as well as my own, whether you intend to confine us here forever." "Monsieur Aronnax, I will reply to you today as I replied to you 7 months ago. Whoever enters the Nautilus must never leave it." But this is slavery you would impose. You may give it any name you please. But in every country a slave reserves the right to regain his liberty by whatever means he can. And who has denied you this right? Have I ever bound you by any oath? And the captain, folding his arms, regarded me steadfastly. Captain Nemo, said I, to revert to this subject will not be to the taste of either of us, but as we have once entered upon it, let us go through with it. I repeat, it is not only for myself, for my studies are a relaxation, a passion that swallows up all other thoughts. Like yourself, I am one to live unnoticed, obscure in the distant hope of bequeathing the results of my work to a future age. In a word, I can admire you. You have taken up a line that I can understand in certain points, but there are other aspects to your life surrounded by mysteries and complications in which I and my companions can take no part. And even when our hearts have been moved by your sorrow, or excited by your acts of genius or courage, we have been obliged to repel any expression of sympathy, however small, which is born at the sight of brave or good actions in a friend or enemy. Well, this feeling that we are strangers to everything about you makes our position unacceptable, impossible, even for me, and above all for Ned Land. Every man worthy of the name of man deserves consideration. Have you ever told yourself that love of liberty, hatred of servitude, can give rise to projects of revenge in such a nature as the Canadian's, that he can think, attempt, put in execution— I was silenced by the captain, who rose and said, Ned Land may think, attempt, or put in execution what he pleases. What does it matter to me? It was not I who sought him. It was not for my pleasure that he remains on board. You, Monsieur Aronnax, are one of those who can understand everything, even silence. I have no more to say. This is the first time you have spoken on this subject to me. Let it be the last, for I will not even listen to a second attempt. I retired. Our situation henceforth was critical. I related the conversation to my two companions. We now know, said Ned, that we have nothing to hope for from him. The Nautilus is approaching Long Island. Let us make our escape, no matter what the weather may be. But the sky became more and more threatening. Signs of a hurricane were not wanting. The atmosphere became white and misty. Delicate cirri clouds were succeeded on the horizon by heavy cumuli. The lower clouds passed overhead very rapidly. The sea got up and rolled in long, swelling waves. Birds, with the petrels, disappeared. The barometer fell rapidly and indicated extreme tension of vapours. The mixture in the storm glass melted under the atmosphere. Excuse me. Now subcharged with electricity. The strife of the elements was at hand. During the 18th of May, the storm burst, just as the Nautilus was off Long Island, some miles from New York. I am able to describe the tempest, for by some unaccountable whim Captain Nemo determined to brave it at the surface of the ocean instead of going beneath the waves. The wind was southwest, first pretty fresh, that is to say about 15 yards in a second, which increased to a rate of 25 yards a second about 3 p.m. Captain Nemo, unmoved by the squalls, had taken his place on the platform. He was lashed round the waist to prevent his being carried away by the enormous waves. I managed to hoist myself up also and made myself secure, dividing my admiration between the storm and the incomprehensible man who encountered it. The raging sea was swept by great, ragged clouds which dipped into the waves. I could not perceive any of those small waves which are formed at the bottom of the great hollows of the billows. Nothing but long, rolling, compact waves which did not break. The Nautilus sometimes on her side, and sometimes almost upright, rolled and pitched fearfully. About 5 o'clock rain fell in torrents, but neither the wind nor the sea abated. The hurricane blew at the rate of more than 45 yards a second, or about 40 leagues an hour. Houses are overturned by such gales as this, and cannon are frequently dismounted, but the Nautilus, in the midst of the tempest, justified the saying of a certain engineer, "There is no well-built hull that cannot defy the sea." She was not a resisting mass, which the waves might have overcome. She was a steel spindle, obedient, mobile, without masts or rigging, and which braved the fury of the waves. I studied these billows attentively. They measured nearly 45 feet in height, and from 150 to 175 feet in length, and the rate at which they travelled, less than the wind, was about 15 yards in a second. Their volume and force increased with the depth of water. I now understand the mission of these waves, which carry a quantity of air in their sides, and carry it to the bottom of the sea where the oxygen it contains gives life. Their extreme forces have been calculated at 6,000 pounds on the square foot. Such waves as these at the Hebrides have displaced a block weighing 80,000 pounds, and, in the Tempest on the 23rd of December, 1864, overturned part of the town of Yedo in Japan, and going at the rate of about 500 miles an hour, broke the same day upon the shores of America. The storm with us increased during the night. The barometer fell 7/10. In the evening, I perceived a large ship on the horizon, labouring painfully. She appeared to be lying to under half steam, and was probably one of the New York steamers from Liverpool or Havre. Darkness soon hid her from our sight. At 10 p.m, the sky was regularly on fire with lightning. I could not support the glare, while Captain Nemo, as he gazed at it, seemed imbued with the spirit of the storm. A mingled and terrible noise of the surging of the waves, the roaring of the wind, and the crashing of the thunder filled the air. The wind seemed to blow from all quarters, and the cyclone first from the east, backed round again to it by the north, west, and south in the inverse direction adopted by circular storms in southern seas. The Gulf Stream well deserves its name of the King of Tempests. These violent storms are caused by the difference of the temperature between the air and its current. The rain had been succeeded by a fiery shower. The drops seemed changed into lightning points. Captain Nemo seemed determined to court death by lightning, a worthy end for such a man. In its violent pitching, the Nautilus would raise the steel spur like a lightning conductor, and long sparks were given out by it. Bruised and exhausted, I crawled to the panel and descended to the saloon. The storm was then at its height, and it was impossible to stand up in the Nautilus. Captain Nemo came down about midnight. I heard the reservoirs filled, and the Nautilus sank slowly beneath the waves. From the saloon windows I could perceive great fish passing in the briny water, quite terrified, while some were actually struck by the lightning as I gazed. The Nautilus continued to descend. I fancied we could have reached calm water at a depth of 16 yards, but no. The upper waters were too rough, and we had to go down to a depth of 50 yards to seek repose. But what quiet, what peace and tranquillity reigned there! Who could have imagined that such a fearful hurricane was raging at the surface of the ocean overhead? Chapter 20. From latitude 47 degrees 24 minutes to longitude 17 degrees 28 minutes. The tempest had driven us to the east. All hope of landing at New York or on the shores of the St. Lawrence had fled. Poor Ned Land, in despair, kept aloof like Captain Nemo. But Conseil and I were together continually. It would be more correct to state that the Nautilus had been carried to the northeast by the storm. For some days we wandered at the surface, sometimes beneath it, surrounded, when above, by those fogs so dreaded by sailors. The fogs are chiefly owing to the melting of the ice, which causes great moisture in the atmosphere. What ships are lost in these latitudes when attempting to ascertain their whereabouts on this dangerous coast? Numerous accidents are due to these thick fogs. The noise of the wind drowns the breaking of the surf. The ships go ashore helplessly. Collisions, in spite of whistles and fog bells. The bottom of these seas look like a battlefield, where the conquered ones of ocean still lie as they fell. Some old and already covered up, some young and bright, reflecting the light of our lantern from bolts and copper sheathings. What a number of ships have been lost, with all hands, off Cape Race, St. Paul Island, Straits of Belle Isle, and in the estuary of the St. Lawrence. The Solway, the Isis, the Parramatta, the Hungarian, the Canadian, the Anglo-Saxon, the Humboldt, the United States, all foundered. The Arctic, the Lyonnaise, sprung leaks. The President, the Pacific, and the city of Glasgow disappeared from causes unknown. A funeral line, along which the Nautilus glided, as if it were holding a review of the dead. On the 16th of May, we reached the southern end of the Bank of Newfoundland. This bank is composed of organic matter, alluvial deposits, brought from the equator by the Gulf Stream, or from the North Pole by the counter-cold water current that washes the American coast. There, also, are formed those erratic blocks, drifted along with the broken-up ice. There is also a vast charnel house of fish, mollusks or zoophytes which perish by hundreds of millions. The depth of the sea is not great off Newfoundland, a few hundred fathoms only, but towards the south it dips suddenly to 3,000 yards. There the Gulf Stream widens out, it loses speed and temperature, but becomes a sea. Amongst the fish I noted the Cyclopterus, the Mernac of large size and excellent taste, Carracs with large dog eyes, blennies, gobies, etc., etc. The nets brought up a very hardy, bold and vigorous fish, armed with spikes and prickly fins, a sea scorpion about 9 feet long, and the determined enemy of blenny, gads and salmon. We had some difficulty to lay hold of this animal, which, thanks to the formation of its opercules, prevents its respiratory organs from the drying contact with the atmosphere, and can live for some time out of water. And I must not omit the codfish, in its favourite waters on the inexhaustible Bank of Newfoundland. One may say that these cod are mountain fish, for Newfoundland is nothing but a submarine mountain. When the Nautilus cut her way through their thick masses, Conseil could not help saying, "Ah, cod! I always fancied that cod were flat fish, like dabs or soles." "Stupid," I said. "Cod are only flat at the fishmongers, where they are displayed opened and spread out. In the water they are rounded like mullet, and constructed perfectly for swimming." "I dare say," replied Conseil, "but what a quantity there are!" "And there would be a great many thousand more, but they have enemies, fishes and men. Do you know how many eggs there are in a female cod?" "Let me give a good guess," said Conseil. 500,000? 11 millions, my friend. 11 millions! Exclaimed Conseil. "I cannot believe that unless I count them myself." "Well, count, Conseil. But the fish is taken in thousands by the French, English, Americans, Danes and Norwegians. They all consume enormous quantities, and were it not for the fecundity of these animals, the sea would soon be cleared of them. Thus, England and America alone have 5,000 ships, manned by 75,000 sailors, employed in the cod fishery. Each ship takes 40,000 at least, which gives a total of 25 million. It is the same on the coast of Norway. "Well," said Conseil, "I agree, and I will not count them." "Count what?" "The eggs. The 11 millions. But I will make a remark." "What is that?" "Merely that if all the eggs were hatched, 4 cod would be sufficient to supply England and America." During our inspection of the banks of Newfoundland, I could distinguish the long fishing lines, armed with 200 hooks, which every boat throws over by dozens. The Nautilus had some trouble to escape this submarine network. However, we did not remain long in these crowded places. We went up to the 42nd degree of latitude, as high as St. John's and Heart's Content, where the Atlantic cable emerges. The Nautilus, instead of continuing to the north, turned in an easterly direction, as if it wished to follow up the plane upon which the telegraphic cable is laid. It was on the 17th of May, about 500 miles from Heart's Content, at a depth of 2,900 yards, that I perceived the cable lying on the ground. Conseil, whom I had not told of it, took it for a large sea serpent and was about to class it as usual, but I undeceived him, and, to console him, gave him some particulars concerning the laying of the cable. The first cable was established during the years 1857 and 1858, but, after having transmitted about 4,000 telegrams, it stopped working. In 1863 another was constructed, over 2,000 miles long and weighing 4,500 tons, which was shipped in the Great Eastern. This attempt did not succeed. Now the Nautilus, on the 25th of May, was on the exact spot at which the breakage occurred which ruined the Enterprise. It was 638 miles from the Irish coast. At 2 p.m. they perceived that the communication was interrupted. The electricians determined to cut the cable before fishing for it, and at 11 p.m. they found the damaged part. They spliced it and resank it, but some days later it broke again, and in such deep water that it could not be recovered. The Americans were not discouraged. The brave Cyrus Field, the promoter of the undertaking, who had embarked all his fortune in it, started another subscription. It was well responded to. Another cable was made on better principles. The wires were wrapped in gutta percha, protected by a covering of hemp and surrounded by a metallic skin. The Great Eastern sailed with it on the 13th of July, 1866. The operation proceeded successfully, but an incident happened. It was remarked that nails were frequently found inserted in the cable with a view to injure it. Captain Anderson, his officers, and the scientific men held a consultation, and a notice was promulgated that, if anyone were discovered as the author of such an action, he would be incontinently flung into the sea. No further attempt to spoil the cable was made. On the 23rd of July, the Great Eastern was only about 500 miles from Newfoundland, when a telegram from Ireland apprised those on board of the armistice between Prussia and Austria after Sadowa. On the 27th, in thick fogs, they reached Heart's Content. The enterprise had fairly and happily succeeded, and the first telegram young America sent to Mother England were the grand words so rarely comprehended: "Glory to God in the highest, peace on earth, goodwill towards men." I did not expect to find the electric cable in the same state as when it left the manufactory. The long serpent, covered with the debris of shells, was encased with a strong coating which protected it against boring mollusks. It lay undisturbed by the motion of the sea, and under favourable pressure for the transmission of the electric spark, which passes from America to Europe in 0.32 of a second. The duration of this cable will be almost indefinite, for the gutta percha is improved by the salt water. Besides, on this well-selected level, the cable is never so deeply immerged as to break. The Nautilus went to its lowest depth, situated 4,431 yards, and there it lay without any distension. We then arrived at the spot where the accident of 1863 happened. The ocean bed forms a large valley, upon which Mont Blanc might be placed without the top appearing above the water. This valley is enclosed on the east by a perpendicular wall more than 2,000 yards high. We arrived there on the 28th of May, and the Nautilus was then only 120 miles from the Irish coast. Did Captain Nemo wish to reach the British Isles? No. To my great surprise, he again turned southward, and to European seas. In rounding the Emerald Isle, I perceived Cape Clear for a moment, and the Fastnet lighthouse which guides the thousands of ships bound for Liverpool and Glasgow. An important question presented itself in my mind. Did the Nautilus dare to enter the English Channel? Ned, who had reappeared since we sighted land, did not cease to inquire. How could I reply? Captain Nemo was still invisible to us. Having permitted the Canadian a glimpse of America, perhaps he was going to give me a look at France? But we went south still. On the 30th of May we passed the Land's End, leaving the Scilly Isles to starboard. If Captain Nemo wished to enter the English Channel, he must now go east, but he did not. During the whole of the 31st, the Nautilus described a series of circles in the sea, which puzzled me greatly. It seemed as if search were being made to find a spot difficult to hit on. At midday, Captain Nemo came up on the platform to take the position himself. He did not speak a word, and seemed more reserved than ever. What had made him so sad? Was it the proximity of the European shores? Had he some remembrances of his abandoned native land? This thought haunted me, and I began to think that I should soon, by a happy chance, discover the captain's secrets. Next day, the 1st of June, the Nautilus continued her manoeuvres. It was evident some precise spot was wanted. Captain Nemo came up, as on the previous day. The sea was calm, the sky clear. 8 miles off, a great steamer trailed a line of smoke across the horizon. She showed no colours, and I could not ascertain her nationality. Captain Nemo took his sextant and began to observe the sun, some minutes before it reached the meridian. The absolute calm assisted this operation. The Nautilus did not move at all. I was on the platform at that time. When the observation had been completed, Captain Nemo merely said, "Here it is," and descended to his room. Had he seen the ship, which had changed her course and now approached us? I could not tell. I returned to the saloon. The panel was shut. I heard the water entering the reservoirs. The Nautilus sank direct, for the screw did not move. A few minutes later we were aground at 835 yards. The ceiling was lighted up, the windows were opened, and I could watch the sea brilliantly illuminated by our electric lamp for half a mile round. To port there was nothing but the watery expanse, but to starboard appeared a large mass which riveted my attention. It was like a ruin buried beneath white shells, as under a mantle of snow. Examining it attentively, I fancied I could distinguish a vessel, mastless, which must have foundered. The wreck must be an old one. Many years must have passed for it to have become so encrusted with the lime of the ocean. What was this ship? Why should the Nautilus visit its tomb? Was it a shipwreck in the ordinary sense? I did not know what to think, when suddenly close by me I heard the captain's voice. "That vessel," he said slowly, "was formerly called the Marseillaise. She carried 74 guns and was launched in 1762. In 1778, Commanded by La Pope Vetrio, she fought the Preston. On 4th of July, 1779, she was at the taking of Grenada with the fleet of Admiral Estang. On 5th of September, 1781, she took part in the action in Chesapeake Bay. In 1794, her name was changed by the French Republic. On the 16th of April of the same year, she joined the fleet of Villars-Joyeuse at Brest, charged to escort a convoy of corn to come from America under the command of Admiral Van Stabel. On the 11th and 12th Prairial of Year 2, the squadron encountered the English fleet. Today, Monsieur, is the 13th Prairial, the 1st of June, 1868. 74 years ago, this day, at this place, in 47 degrees 24 minutes latitude, and 17 degrees 28 minutes longitude, this ship, after a gallant fight, dismasted with a leak sprung, a third of her crew disabled, preferred to sink with her 356 sailors than to surrender, and, nailing their colours to the poop, they disappeared beneath the waves, crying, "Vive la République!" "The Vengeur!" I exclaimed. "Yes, monsieur, the Vengeur. A good name," he muttered, the captain, as he folded his arms. And that brings us to the end of that chapter and the second break for this evening. So, once again, I invite you to get up, have a stretch, do what needs to be done to make yourself comfortable, and we will see you back here in about 5 minutes' time. Thank you. And we come back to what you may be able to hear, the sound of cat purring, because Joey's been in my room the whole time, and surprisingly, well, if I say like docile and well behaved, does mean he's been asleep on the bed, and has now woken up and noticed that I'm here and come over to settle on my lap instead. So I'm hoping you can hear the purring. That's what that is. How will you survive the cat purring? I know. It's just not fair. But yeah, we come back now from the break for the last part of this. We're on page 320. Nice. And let me just find where we end. 335. So we have 15 pages to go. So this might be a slightly shorter section, but yeah, let's jump right back in. Chapter 21. A Hecatomb. The style of address, the unexpected scene, this history of a ship of my country, so coldly told at first, then the emotion with which the strange individual had pronounced the last words, the significance of the name, Avenger, were all impressed deeply upon my mind. My gaze did not quit the captain. He, with outstretched hands, was watching with glittering eyes the glorious wreck. Perhaps I should never know who he was, whence he came, or whither he went, but I know that the man disengaged himself from the savant. It was no ordinary misanthropy that caused Captain Nemo to hide himself with his companions in the Nautilus, but a hatred, whether monstrous or sublime, that time could not enfeeble. And Joey wishes to leave. 1 second. It's all part of owning a cat. Did this hatred still demand vengeance? The future would disclose this. Meanwhile, the Nautilus rose slowly, and the confused forms of the Avenger disappeared by degrees. A slight rolling motion indicated our arrival at the surface. At that moment, a dull roar was heard. I looked at the captain. He did not stir. "Captain," I said. He did not reply, so I left him and mounted to the platform. Conseil and the Canadian had preceded me. "What is the meaning of that sound?" I asked. "It was a cannon shot," replied Ned Land. I looked towards the ship I had seen before. It had approached the Nautilus and was coming at high speed. It was 6 miles away. "What ship is that, Ned?" "Judging by her rigging and spars, I should say she is a man-of-war. I hope she may come up with us and, if possible, sink this damned Nautilus." "Friend Ned," said Conseil, "what harm can she do to the Nautilus? Can she attack us under water?" "Tell me, Ned," I said, "can you see what nation this vessel belongs?" The Canadian frowned, lowered his eyelids, and gazed for some seconds at the vessel earnestly. "No," he replied at length. "I do not know to what country she belongs. Her ensign is not at the peak, but I can swear she is a man-of-war because of the pennant at the main." For a quarter of an hour we continued to gaze at the approaching ship. I could not quite believe that she could have distinguished the Nautilus at such a distance, still less have guessed that she was a submarine engine. The Canadian soon informed me that the newcomer was a large man-of-war, a 2-decked ironclad ram. A thick, black smoke escaped from her 2 funnels. Her sails were furled. She had no ensign. The distance prevented our distinguishing the colours of the pennant, which blew out like a long ribbon. She rapidly approached us. If Captain Nemo remained apathetic, here was our chance to escape. "Monsieur," said Ned Land to me, "when this vessel is a mile distant, I will throw myself into the sea, and I should suggest you're doing the same thing." To this I made no reply, but continued to look at the vessel, which became rapidly more distinguishable. French, English, American, or Russian, she would receive us hospitably if we could only get on board. "Monsieur will remember," said Conseil, "that we have some little experience of swimming. He can rest upon me if he decides to follow Ned Land." I was about to reply when a puff of white smoke burst from the man-of-war. Some seconds later the water was splashed up by the fall of a heavy shot astern of the Nautilus. A little later the report came to our ears. "Hello, they are firing at us!" I exclaimed. "Good men," murmured the Canadian. "They evidently do not take us for shipwrecked sailors," said I. "If Monsieur has no objection—" "Good," said Conseil, as another shot ploughed up the water close to us. "If Monsieur has no objection, I think they have recognized the narwhal and are cannonading it." "But they ought to see that there are human beings in question," I said. "Perhaps that is why they fire," said Ned, looking at me. A sudden idea struck me. No doubt they had formed their own conclusions respecting the pretended monster. Doubtless, on board the Abraham Lincoln, when the Canadian struck the narwhal with the harpoon, Commodore Farragut had perceived that it was in reality a submarine vessel more dangerous than a supernatural cetacean. Yes, this must be it, and in every sea they were now pursuing this engine of destruction. It was indeed terrible if, as we thought, Captain Nemo used the Nautilus in a scheme of vengeance. Did he not attack some ship that night in the Indian Ocean when we were imprisoned? Had not that man who was buried in the coral cemetery fallen a victim to the attack provoked by the Nautilus? Yes, it must be so. One portion of Captain Nemo's mysterious existence was developing itself, and if his identity were not established, at least several nations had banded against him and now hunted him, not as a chimera, but as a man who had vowed an implacable hatred against them. All the terrible past rose up before me. Instead of meeting friends on board the attacking vessel, we should only find pitiless enemies. Meantime, the cannon shot kept flying about our ears, some striking the water, ricocheted and sank at a great distance, but none of them hit the Nautilus. The ironclad was then only 3 miles away, but notwithstanding the tremendous cannonade, Captain Nemo did not appear on the platform, and yet had one of these conical shots struck the Nautilus, it would have been fatal. The Canadian then said, "Ought we not to endeavour to get out of this scrape? Let us make signals. They will perhaps understand that we are honest people." Ned Land took his handkerchief to wave at them, but scarcely had he opened it than he was struck down by an iron hand, and, notwithstanding his great strength, he fell upon the deck. "Wretch!" cried Captain Nemo. "Do you wish to be immolated on the spur of the Nautilus before it is hurled against yonder ship?" Captain Nemo, terrible to hear, was still more terrible to see. His face was pale as death from a spasm of the heart, which had for an instant ceased to beat. The pupils of his eyes were contracted. His voice did not sound. It was almost a roar that issued from his throat as he grasped the Canadian's shoulder. Then he turned from Ned towards the man-of-war, from which the shot showered round him. "Ah, you know who I am, you ship of accursed race!" he cried in his powerful tones. "I don't want to see your colours to recognise your breed. Look here, I will show you mine." And he displayed a black flag similar to that which he had planted at the South Pole. At that moment a shot struck the Nautilus obliquely, and without damaging her flew close by the captain and fell into the sea. He shrugged his shoulders, then addressing me said, "Go below, you and your companions." "Monsieur," I cried, "do you intend to attack that ship?" "Monsieur, I'm going to sink her." "You will not do that, surely?" "I will," replied Captain Nemo coldly, "and I advise you not to pass judgment upon me. Fate has shown you what you ought not to have seen. The attack has begun. The reprisal will be terrible. Go down." "What ship is this?" I asked. "Do you not know? So much the better. Her nationality at least is a secret to you. Go down." The Canadian, Conseil, and I had no choice. 15 sailors surrounded the captain and seemed to regard the approaching vessel with intense hatred. We felt the same spirit of revenge animated them all. I descended, and at that moment another shot hulled the Nautilus. I heard the captain cry out, "Strike, you mad vessel! Let fly your useless shot! You shall not escape the Nautilus, but you shall not perish here. Your wreck shall not mingle with that of the Avenger." I regained my cabin. The captain and the mate were still on the platform. The screw was put in motion. The Nautilus distanced her pursuer very quickly and was soon out of range, but the chase continued, and Captain Nemo contented himself with keeping his distance. About 4 p.m., I could not restrain the impatience and restlessness that was consuming me. I went to the foot of the staircase. The panel was open. I ventured upon the platform. The captain was walking up and down in a very excited manner. He kept looking at the man-of-war to leeward, about 5 or 6 miles away. He was sailing round it and drawing the pursuit towards the east, but he did not attack it. Perhaps he hesitated to do so after all. I wished to intercede once again, but I had hardly opened my mouth to Captain Nemo when he silenced me. "I am the law here. I am justice. I am the oppressed, and yonder is the oppressor. Through him I have lost everything I loved, cherished, venerated. Country, wife, children, father, mother. I have seen them all perish. All I hate is there. Be silent." I took a last look at the man-of-war now steaming at high pressure, and then I rejoined Conseil and Ned. "We will fly this," I exclaimed. "Good," said Ned, "but what ship is it?" "I do not know," I replied, "but whatever it be, it will be sunk during the night. Better perish with it than be accomplices in a war of reprisal of which we do not understand the justice." "That is my opinion," replied Ned. "Let us wait until night." Night came. A deep silence reigned on board. The compass indicated that the Nautilus still held her course. I heard the rapid throbbings of the screw. We were still at the surface, and a slight roll affected the Nautilus. My companions and I had determined to escape so soon as the ship was sufficiently near to make ourselves heard or seen, for the moon, which was nearly at the full, shone brightly. Once on board the other ship, we could prevent the attack that threatened her, or at least do all that the circumstances admitted. Many times I thought that the Nautilus was ready to attack, but Captain Nemo was contented to let the chase approach nearer, and then the Nautilus would again increase her distance. The first part of the night passed without incident. We watched our opportunity. We spoke little, being too much excited to talk. Ned Land wanted to throw himself into the sea, but I persuaded him to wait. I thought the Nautilus would attack the ironclad at the surface of the sea, and then it would not be possible but easy to escape. Not only be possible, but easy to escape. At 3 o'clock, being restless, I ascended to the platform. Captain Nemo had not quitted it. He was standing up at the bow near his flag, which was waving in the breeze over his head. He did not lift his eyes from the ship. His look was one of extraordinary attention, and appeared to attract, to fascinate, and to draw the pursuer along as if it were being towed. The moon was passing the meridian. Jupiter was rising in the east. Amid this peace, heaven and the ocean rivaled each other in tranquillity, and the sea offered to the stars as lovely a mirror as had ever been presented for their reflection. And when I considered this holy calm of the elements compared to the passions raging of the Nautilus, I felt chilled to the heart. The man-of-war was within 2 miles of us. It was approaching nearer and nearer to that phosphorescent gleam which betrayed the whereabouts of the Nautilus. I saw the lights, green and red, and the white lamp suspended to the mizzen stay. A sort of vibration seemed to make the rigging quiver, which indicated a very high pressure of working. Sparks flew up from the funnels and shone in the air like stars. I remained thus till 4 a.m., without Captain Nemo having perceived me. The ship was now 1.5 miles away, and at dawn the cannonade recommenced. The moment could not be far when, as the Nautilus attacked the ship, we could make our escape. I was about to descend when the mate appeared upon the platform. Several sailors accompanied him. Captain Nemo either did not see or did not wish to see them. Certain preparations for action were made. They were very simple. The railing around the platform was removed. In the same way, the lantern and pilot cages were lowered to a level with the deck. The surface of the long, cigar-shaped vessel did not offer a single obstruction to its free manoeuvring. I returned to the saloon, the Nautilus still on the surface. The morning rays were beginning to penetrate the water. As the waves undulated, the gleam of the rising sun illuminated the windows. This terrible 2nd of June dawned. At 5 a.m., I perceived that the speed had moderated. I understood that the vessel was to be permitted to approach. Besides, the guns were heard more distinctly, and the shot hissed strangely through the morning air. "My friends," said I, "the time has come. A grasp of the hand, and may heaven preserve us." Ned Land was resolute. Conseil calm. I was nervous, and could scarcely control myself. We passed into the library. As I pushed open the door leading to the central staircase, I heard the upper panel shut sharply. The Canadian hurried up the steps. I stopped him. A well-known hissing sound informed me that the water was coming into the reservoirs, and, in fact, in a few minutes the Nautilus had sunk some yards under water. I understood it all. It was too late to act now. The Nautilus did not dare to attack the ironclad except below the waterline, where there were no iron plates to offer any resistance. We were again imprisoned, unwilling witnesses to the tragedy about to be performed. We had scarcely time to reflect even. Shut in a room, we gazed at each other without speaking. A profound stupor had settled upon my spirits. All throughout appeared to be arrested in my mind. I was in that state of tension which precedes some expected explosion. I waited. I listened. Every sense concentrated in the air. The speed of the Nautilus increased. The rush was coming. The whole fabric trembled. Suddenly I uttered a cry. There was a shock, but comparatively gentle. I felt the penetrating force of the steel spur. I heard a scraping noise, but the Nautilus, carried onward by her immense power of propulsion, passed through the vessel like a needle through canvas. I could contain myself no longer. I rushed madly out of my room into the saloon. Captain Nemo was there, silent, gloomy and implacable. He was looking through the port panel. An enormous mass overshadowed the water, and, so as to lose nothing of the death agony, the Nautilus slowly sank to the abyss beside the ironclad. 10 yards off was the wounded vessel, into which the waves were pouring like a sluice, and beyond a double tier of guns and nettings. The deck was covered with moving black shadows. The water rose higher. The unhappy victims crowded into shrouds, ascended the masts, or struggled in the pitiless water. Paralysed with anguish, my hair grew stiff with terror, my eyes dilated. I could not breathe. And there, breathless, voiceless, I was glued to the spot and gazed at the sight in horror. The enormous vessel sank slowly. The Nautilus, following, watched all her movements. Suddenly an explosion occurred. The confined air had blown up the decks as if by gunpowder. The agitation of the water heeled the Nautilus over. Then the ill-fated vessel sank more rapidly. Her topmasts, covered with victims, appeared before us. Then the yards, bending beneath the weight of the crew. At length the main topgallant mast came in sight. Then the dark mass disappeared, and with it the drowned ship's company dragged underneath by the powerful eddy. I turned to Captain Nemo. That terrible executioner, a true archangel of hate, kept steadily regarding his handiwork. When all was over, he went to his own room. I looked after him. On the wall, beneath the portraits of his heroes, I perceived the likeness of a young woman with 2 little children. Captain Nemo looked at them for some minutes, extended his arms to them, and, falling upon his knees, burst into a passion of sobs. Chapter 22. The Last Words of Captain Nemo. The panels had been shut upon the dreadful spectacle, but no light had been given to the saloon. Darkness and silence now reigned in the Nautilus. We were leaving the desolation behind us at a tremendous rate, but whither were we flying? North or south? Did that man wish to escape the horrible reprisal? I re-entered my room, where I found Conseil and Ned sitting in silence. I experienced an insurmountable disgust for Captain Nemo. No matter how much he had suffered from mankind, he had no right to act as he had done. He had made me, if not an accomplice, a witness to his vengeance. It was too much. At 11 o'clock, light was given us. I entered the saloon. It was empty. I inspected the various instruments. We were going north at 25 miles an hour, sometimes at the surface, sometimes 30 feet beneath the waves. Taking the bearings on the chart, I saw that we were passing the mouth of the British Channel and were advancing rapidly towards the northern seas. I could scarcely see the various fish we passed, but it was now a question of studying and classifying. So it's not now a question of studying and classifying. In the evening, we had crossed 200 leagues of the Atlantic. Evening came, and the sea would be dark till the moon rose. I regained my room. I could not sleep long. I suffered from nightmare. The horrible scene I had witnessed kept recurring to my mind. Who could now tell to what part of the North Atlantic Captain Nemo would take us? We still were travelling at speed, and in the midst of northern fogs. Should we go up to Spitzbergen or Nova Zembla, or explore those unknown seas, the White Sea, the Sea of Kara, the Gulf of Obi, the archipelago of Liarov, and the equally strange coasts of the Asiatic continent? I could not tell. The clocks on board had been stopped, so we could no longer judge the flight of time. It seemed that day and night, as in polar regions, no longer followed in regular rotation. I felt I was being dragged into that wild region where the imagination can run riot, as in the mysterious tales of Edgar Poe. At each moment I expected to see, like the fabulous Gordon Pym, that veiled figure of a size exceeding all inhabitants of Earth, thrown across the cataract that defends the approach to the pole. I estimated, though perhaps I was mistaken, that this wild course of the Nautilus lasted 15 or 20 days, and how much longer it might have continued I do not know, had not a catastrophe brought our voyage to a conclusion. Neither Captain Nemo, the mate, nor any of the sailors ever appeared now. The Nautilus was almost always beneath the water. When it did rise to the surface to replenish the air, the panels opened automatically. The reckoning was no longer marked on the chart. I could not tell where we were. Moreover, the Canadian, who had come to an end of his strength and patience, kept aloof also. Conseil could not induce him to speak, and fearing in an excess of delirium, and under the influence of the terrible homesickness that devoured him, he would kill himself, he watched him untiringly. One can understand that, under all the circumstances, the situation was scarcely bearable. One morning, I do not know the date, I was sleeping heavily towards dawn, when I awoke and found Ned Land leaning over me, and he said in a low tone, "We are going to escape." I sat up at once. "When?" I asked. "Tonight. All surveillance on board the Nautilus seems over. They all appear stupefied. You will be ready, sir?" "Yes. Whereabouts are we?" "In sight of land, which I observed through the fog this morning, 20 miles to the east." "What land is it?" "I do not know, but whatever land it may be, we will escape thither." "Yes, Ned, we will fly tonight, even should the sea swallow us up." "The sea is high, and the wind is strong, but 20 miles in that light boat does not frighten me. I have succeeded in putting on board some food and water." "I will follow you," I said. "But," said the Canadian, "if I am surprised, I will fight, and they will perhaps kill me." "We will die together, Ned." I had decided. The Canadian left me. I gained the platform, upon which I could scarcely withstand the shock of the waves. The sky was threatening, but as we were so near land, we were obliged to make our escape. We must not lose a day, not an hour. I returned to the saloon, both hoping and fearing to meet Captain Nemo, wishing and yet not wishing to see him. What had I to say to him? Could I hide the horror with which he inspired me? No! Better not to find myself face to face with him, better to forget him entirely, and nevertheless... What a long day this was, the last that I was to pass on board the Nautilus. I remained by myself. Ned and Conseil did not speak to me for fear of betraying themselves. I dined at 6 o'clock, but I had no appetite. I forced myself to eat so as to keep up my strength. At 6:30, Ned Land entered my room and said, "We shall not meet again before we leave. At 10 o'clock the moon will not be up. We will take advantage of the darkness. Come to the boat, and Conseil and I will await you there." The Canadian went out, without giving me time to reply. I wanted to verify the course of the Nautilus. I went into the saloon. We were running north-northeast with tremendous speed, at a depth of rather more than 50 yards. I took a last look at all the marvels of nature around, the art riches heaped up in the museum, on this unrivalled collection destined to perish some day at the bottom of the sea which it had yielded up. I wished to fix the impression upon my mind. I remained thus for an hour, beneath the light of the luminous ceiling, and, passing in review those beautiful specimens in the glass cases, then returned to my room. I then donned some stout sea clothing, and collected my notes, and secured them carefully about my person. My heart beat loudly. I could not help it. My trouble and agitation would certainly have betrayed me to Captain Nemo. What was he doing at that moment? I listened at the door of his room. I could hear footsteps. Captain Nemo was there, and had not retired to rest. At every movement it seemed to me as if he were about to appear and ask me why I was going to escape. I was nervously sensitive. My imagination magnified everything around me. This impression became so vivid that I began to think whether it would not be better to go into the captain's room, see him face to face, and beard the lion in his den. This was madness. Fortunately, I restrained myself and lay down on my bed to cool my agitation. My nerves became more calm by degrees, but my brain was at work. I seemed to see all over again the pleasant and unpleasant incidents that had happened since our disappearance from the Abraham Lincoln. The submarine shooting party, Torres Strait, the Papuan natives, our stranding, the coral cemetery, the Suez Passage, the island of Saltorin, the Cretan diver, Vigo Bay, Atlantis, the iceberg, the South Pole, the imprisonment in the ice, the octopus fight, the tempest in the Gulf Stream, the Avenger, and the last horrible scene of the vessel sent to the bottom with all hands. All these events passed before my mental vision like the scenes at a theatre. Then Captain Nemo seemed to increase in size tremendously in this strange medley. His apparition forced itself in and took superhuman proportions. He was no longer my equal. He was the man of the waters, the genius of the seas. It was then 9:30. I held my head between my hands to still its throbbing. I shut my eyes and tried not to think. Another half hour. A half hour of nightmare would drive me mad. At that moment, I fancied I heard the distant notes of the organ, a sad harmony, like the wail of a soul which longed to break its earthly bonds. I listened intently, scarcely breathing, plunged like Captain Nemo in one of those musical ecstasies which lead one beyond the limits of this world. Then a sudden idea terrified me. Captain Nemo had left his room. He was in the saloon, and I must cross it to escape. There I might meet him for the last time. He would see, would speak to me, perhaps. A gesture of his could annihilate me. A word chain me to the ship forever. It was on the stroke of 10. The moment had come to leave my room and join my friends. It would not do to hesitate, for fear that Captain Nemo should anticipate me. I opened the door of my room carefully, and yet it seemed to make a great noise as I opened it. Perhaps this noise only existed in my imagination. I then crept along the dark passage, pausing at each step to still the beating of my heart. I reached the door of the saloon and opened it very gently. The room was perfectly dark. The organ sounded faintly. Captain Nemo was there and had not seen me. I really believe that had there been light in the room he would not have noticed me, so absorbed was he in his music. I crept along the carpet, avoiding the least contact that would have betrayed my presence. It took me fully 5 minutes to gain the door, which opened into the library. I was about to open it, when a deep sigh from Captain Nemo glued me to my place. I could perceive that he was rising from the instrument, for some rays of light filtered into the room. He came towards me with folded arms, silent, gliding like a ghost rather than walking. His bosom heaved with sobs, and I heard him murmur these words, the last I ever heard him speak. "Enough! Enough! Oh, Almighty God, enough!" Was this the effect of remorse which thus escaped from the overladen conscience of a man? In a sort of despair I precipitated myself into the library and rushed up the central staircase and, following the upper turn, reached the boat. I entered it by the opening which had already given ingress to my two companions. "Let us be off! Let us go!" I cried. "In 1 second," replied the Canadian. The opening in the Nautilus was first closed and secured by Ned Land by means of a key he had discovered. The opening in the boat was likewise fastened, and then the Canadian began to release the screws which held us to the Nautilus. Suddenly a noise within the vessel was heard. Voices replied loudly. What had happened? Had our flight been discovered? I felt Ned Land slip a poniard into my hand. "Yes," I murmured. We can die like men." The Canadian ceased working, but a word, repeated 20 times, a terrible word, revealed to me the cause of the agitation within the Nautilus. The crew were not troubling themselves about us at all. "The maelstrom! The maelstrom!" cried Ned. The maelstrom. No more terrible word, and no more horrible situation than ours could be conceived. We were, then, in close proximity to the dangerous Norwegian coast. Had the Nautilus been drawn into the whirlpool just as our boat was about to quit the ship? It is well known that at flood tide the waters pent up between Lofoten and the Faroe Islands are precipitated together with tremendous violence and form a whirlpool from which no ship can escape. On every side of us huge waves were rearing their crests and forming a gulf which has been rightly called the navel of the ocean, whose power of attraction extends to a distance of about 12 miles round. There, not vessels only, but whales and even white bears from the northern regions meet their doom. It was to this terrible fate that the Nautilus, whether designedly or not, was rushing. It was describing a circle, the circumference of which was gradually lessening, and the boat, which was attached to the side, was thus carried along with appalling speed. I got giddy. I felt that sensation which is produced by turning round for a long time rapidly. We were dreadfully alarmed. Horror had reached its limits. Circulation had ceased. Our nervous force was annihilated. We were bathed in a cold perspiration of agony. What a noise rose round us, roarings which the echoes repeated several miles away. The noise of the waves breaking upon the sharp rocks below, where the stoutest bodies are broken to pieces, where trunks of trees are worn away and become like fur, to use the Norwegian term. What a situation it was! We were tossed about like a cork. The Nautilus defended herself like a human being. The steel muscles were strained. Sometimes it rose upright, and we along with it. "We must hold on tightly," said Ned, "and see about the bolts. If we stand by the Nautilus, we may be saved yet." He was still speaking when a crashing noise was heard. The screws gave way, and the boat was hurled like a stone from a sling into the very centre of the whirlpool. My head was struck by a piece of iron, and the violence of the blow deprived me of consciousness. Chapter 23. Conclusion. There was an end to our voyage under the sea. What passed during the night, and how the boat escaped from the terrible jaws of the maelstrom, how Ned Land, Conseil, and I ever came out of the gulf alive, I cannot tell. When I came to myself, I was lying in a fisherman's hut in the Lofoten Islands. My two companions, safe and sound, were beside me, holding my hands in theirs. We embraced each other joyfully. We had no chance to return to France then. Communication between the north of Norway and the southern ports is rare. I was therefore obliged to wait for the starting of the steamboat which plies bi-monthly from the North Cape. So, now, amongst the kind-hearted people who have rescued us, I am revising these notes of our adventures. It is quite true. Not a fact has been omitted, not a detail exaggerated. It is the faithful narrative of this incredible expedition beneath the element inaccessible to mankind, but which progress will one day open up. Shall I be credited? I do not know. After all, it matters little. What I now declare is that I have a right to speak of those seas beneath which I have traversed 20,000 leagues in less than 10 months in a submarine tour of the world, which has revealed to me the wonders of the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, the southern and northern polar seas. But what became of the Nautilus? Did it resist the maelstrom? Is Captain Nemo still living? Does he still exact his terrible reprisals, or did he cease forever after that last hecatomb? Will the waves one day bring to land that manuscript which contains the whole story of his life? Shall I ever know the name of the man? Or will the missing vessel tell us by the fact of its nationality, that of Captain Nemo? I hope so. And I also trust that his powerful ship has overcome the maelstrom, and that the Nautilus survives where so many vessels have perished. If it be so, if Captain Nemo still inhabits the ocean, his adopted country, so to speak, may the hatred of that savage breast be appeased. May the contemplation of so many wonders calm the spirit of revenge in him. May the judge disappear, and the savant continue his peaceful exploration of the sea. If his fate be a strange one, there is something sublime in it also. Have I not comprehended it myself? Have I not lived for 10 months of that unnatural existence? So, to the question propounded 3,000 years ago by Ecclesiastes, who has ever sounded the depths of the abyss? 2 men only of all the world have the right to reply: Captain Nemo and myself. Thank you for listening.